درود و سلام بینندگان و شنوندگان عزیز، به برنامه این هفته یک نگاه خوش اومدین. مهمون من این هفته اندرو گلیلی هست از اتحاد برای دموکراسی در ایران نوفدی، مشاور سیاستگذاری هست. با اون در مورد جمهوری اسلامی ایران، زن، زندگی، آزادی و وضعیت هسته‌ای و دیگر مسائل مربوط به ایران گفتگو می‌کنیم. Andrew, thank you so much. Thank you for talking to us, Voice of America Persian Service. Let me start with this. Since this is election year, everyone has the books are open for the current administration for any criticism. How do you evaluate President Biden Iran policy first term? Failures and outcomes.
I think you have to start from the beginning. So the issue to sum it all up is really the lack of policy on Iran. And it starts with what the administration said when they entered office, which was our aim is to reach a longer, stronger nuclear deal with Iran. Still, their first action was kind of reversing the maximum pressure campaign that had been instilled from the previous administration. They didn't lift all the sanctions, but it's clear that they haven't, that they stopped enforcing the sanctions. But those first 2 years, we can kind of break it up into 2 years and 2 years of the Biden administration. The first 2 years was characterized by their attempts to reach a new nuclear deal. Again, they said longer, stronger was the goal. The deal that had been negotiated, and it's a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's important to remember, the deal that was being negotiated was not longer, stronger. It was much shorter, much weaker. For example, the original JCPOA, one of the prime benefits touted by the people who negotiated it was that it would push Iran's nuclear breakout time to 1 year. The deal that was being negotiated by the Biden administration was going to be at most a few months of breakout time after the deal expired. There was going to be non-nuclear sanctions relief. They were going to lift the foreign terrorist organization designation until there was a lot of pushback in the United States. And that deal fell apart, not really because we weren't going to concede enough, but mostly because the Islamic Republic didn't want to make that deal. They made that clear because every time there was a deal on the table, they said, yeah, but we need some more. And so that was kind of the first 2 years. We lifted sanctions, we appeased the regime, we tried to get a deal that didn't work. That fell apart around August, September 2022. And right around that time, right after that, Mahsa Amini was killed. The Women Life Freedom protest started in Iran. The Biden administration realized, I think mostly politically, making a deal with the regime at this moment for the next year or so, while there's revolutionary protests in the streets, while they're killing Iranians, arresting, executing, harassing Iranians, it won't work. So instead, for these last 2 years leading up to today, there was a series of de-escalatory agreements or understandings. The idea here, this included things like the hostage ransom deal, where we paid $6 billion for 5 hostages. The idea here is we could appease Iran, lift the sanctions, not put too much pressure on them, and they would de-escalate in the region. We can see how that worked out, right? October 7th happened with the Iranian proxies attacking Israel. You have the Houthis attacking everyone. Hezbollah is doing their thing. So the de-escalation never happened. The appeasement did happen. Iran got money. We released a ton of, I think Jehani has reported $80 billion in the lack of sanctions relief. There's the $6 billion in the hostage deal. There's multiple release of frozen funds from South Korea and Iraq. 10 billion, 6 billion here, 10 billion there. So all of that is what's been happening. And I think the outcomes are relatively clear. If you look at the numbers, Iran's military expenditure is way up. Their oil exports are higher than in the last 5 years they've ever been. Harassment of the Iranian people has increased. Executions in Iran has increased. And then, the nuclear program, which maybe we'll get into later, but the nuclear program has also advanced dramatically since President Biden entered office.
Well, we talked about, as you mentioned, lack of policy in some ways. You mentioned failures, that they couldn't achieve anything. Is there anything that you could address as outcome, that they gained something?
The one thing, I don't know if I can credit the administration for this. The one thing that I think has been gained in the last 4 years is a narrative shift. And what I'll credit the Biden administration for is the rhetoric shift. When Mahsa Amini was killed, when the Women Life Freedom protest started, a lot of people, including myself and NUFDI, were concerned it would be the reaction from the Biden administration would be more similar to the Obama administration when they were protesting Iran during his term, which their theory was it's best that we don't get involved. If we get involved, they'll say it's a U.S. Zionist instilled protest, and it'll actually take away from it, so we shouldn't support it. That is not what happened. The U.S. was very good rhetorically, and I'll quickly bring up, I think, the change in special envoy for Iran was important here. The former special envoy for Iran, Rob Malley, is under investigation for potentially transferring classified documents to his personal cell phone, and couple that with the Iran Experts Initiative revelations about U.S. think tank and government officials potentially working with Iran. When that changed and Abram Paley was brought in as special envoy for Iran, the rhetoric also changed dramatically. It went from talking about reforms for Iran to the Iranian people want democracy, which is, it's just a message. It's just words. They do matter. So that, I think, is one of the biggest things that that the Biden administration did do is change the rhetoric and break that mold of we shouldn't support it because they'll think that it's a U.S. protest.
Yeah, you nicely cut the 4 years in 2 and 2. First two, I get it that Biden administration came with an initiative, say let's go back to JCPOA. President Biden campaigned even that I will bring United States back to JCPOA. But 2 years in, two things happens. There's a war that Russia starts against Ukraine and invades Ukraine, and for anyone, I don't think anyone could see it, but Islamic Republic decided to back Russia in a war that is in European soil. It has nothing to do with the Islamic Republic, although they don't even have a bad relationship with Ukraine. Coupled with the Houthis being more and more aggressive, and at the same time Hamas being aggressive because of they receive lots of supports. Do you think at that 2 years junction, seeing the Islamic Republic behavior, there should have been recalibration or reassessment of if this policy is a good policy?
Yeah, I think everything you just said is evidence of the lack of deterrence that the United States has instilled. First, with Iran and Russia, there's a very straightforward way to respond to this. The U.S. and Europe have had the opportunity to trigger snapback sanctions at the UN. That is a very easy and reasonable response, not only to Iran selling drones to Russia to kill Ukrainians with, but to Iran's repeated violations of its commitments to the IAEA and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Snapback sanctions would bring back the arms embargo and restrictions on their Iran sale of drones to Russia. And snapback sanctions, importantly, can't just be defeated with a one-vote veto at the UN Security Council. In order to go against the triggering of snapback, Russia or China would have to introduce their own resolution saying we don't want to trigger snapback, and that resolution can be vetoed with one vote. So it's extremely hard if someone chooses to trigger snapback to go against it. And for some reason, it's like not even on the table as an option right now. They censured Iran again at the IAEA, I think last month, but there's no indication that it's going to be followed up by a resolution triggering snapback at the UN Security Council. So Iran is emboldened. For years now, they have defied everything we've asked them to do, whether it's a de-escalatory agreement or their stated commitments to the IAEA. And the options that are there to hold them accountable, we don't take. So if you're the Islamic Republic, there's very little motivation not to keep doing what you're doing. And of course, Khamenei is happy to sacrifice Houthi fighters and Hamas fighters and Hezbollah fighters. Until you acknowledge the head of the octopus, he'll continue to feel emboldened in that sense.
Andrew, when Islamic Republic and the United States had their own, hostility toward the United States. Islamic Republic had always, but in Europe they always wanted to have some kind of a relationship, some negotiation. The move that they did in Ukraine by supporting Russia cost them, the European support. What Islamic Republic is getting out of this?
I guess they've made this calculation that their alliance with China and Russia is their way forward. And part of it is what I was just talking about, which is they're not afraid of the consequences from Europe. So they lost Europe, so what? It's kind of, I think, what the calculation is. Unless they see that Europe is going to hold them accountable, unless they potentially fear a credible military threat from the West, there's very little reason for them not to take Russia's side and China's side and have them backing them, and that's been helpful for them.
We're talking about deterrence. Andrew, when in the wake of October 7th, President Biden said his administration intends to contain the whole the war in that region so it wouldn't spread. One thing happened in return. The proxies of the Islamic Republic became very, very active. Some are, as we speak, still are. Houthis are still are. Do you think that containment policy effectively working?
There seems to be a fundamental misunderstanding of deterrence within the administration, which is they think that they can deter Iran's proxies by just defending from their attacks and occasionally responding to them proportionately. I would think by now that we've learned that that's not going to work. The Houthis clearly haven't responded to that. I think we've hit inside Yemen as a response a few times, but clearly what we're doing is not what the world superpower should be doing. We are supposed to be helping ensure that these trade routes are free and open, and we don't. And there's, the Biden administration put the Houthi designation back on, but there was no excuse to lift the Houthi foreign terrorist organization designation to begin with when President Biden took over, entered office. So that was just another fundamental mistake of why are you lifting the designation on this terrorist group? And one thing I feel the need to add is it's scary to see Americans supporting the Houthis and supporting some of these terrorist proxy groups.
You mean inside the United States?
Inside the United States, yeah. It's just crazy to see.
Well, going back to that, I think everyone saw what happened in the campuses since the wake of the October 7th.
Yeah.
While we read it, the Houthis, I just wanted to add, I think the administration had this argument that in the beginning we would lift the FTE because it makes it easier to send them humanitarian helps, and at the same time give them some time for them to negotiate something.
This concept of lift sanctions waivers for humanitarian aid, I understand, but it's the same thing that they say about giving money to the Islamic Republic. So the hostage deal, for example, it's clearly a ransom deal. If anyone looking at it can say, okay, so you gave them, you freed up $6 billion of their funds and let them have it, and we got hostages. So that's a hostage deal. Now what the U.S. government says is that money can only be used, it's earmarked for humanitarian purposes. Tons of people have responded saying money is fungible, so you have $6 billion more there, you take this, whatever you were going to spend there, you can spend it elsewhere now on the military. There's no real response. They just say, no, we monitor it, none of it's been spent yet. But it appears as an excuse to do what you want in terms of sanctions relief and just say it's going to be for humanitarian purposes. I think we would believe that if we see the situation for the people inside of Iran getting better. Is any of that money being spent on them? The clear answer is no. And this goes back to kind of the narrative shift that we were talking about. It's not fully there, but it's getting there in the sense of there was at one point the idea that a lot of organizations in D.C. like to push that sanctions primarily hurt the Iranian people and they don't do much to affect the regime. The regime elites can still have great lives inside of Iran. The Iranian people have come out and said on the streets, our issue is not sanctions. Our issue is the regime and the people and those elites who are benefiting and living well.
We touched upon the nuclear program and IAEA. In last 8 years, we had two radically different approaches from United States of America. There was maximum pressure, and what President Biden administration called it relentless diplomacy. But if you look at the result, the nuclear program of the Islamic Republic of Iran hasn't been paused, hasn't been lowered, hasn't been slowed, and hasn't been stopped. In fact, it somehow went excessively. What are we missing from these two approaches?
I think I'll start by saying what I think a lot of people who are against the JCPOA don't often say. So we have to acknowledge the JCPOA did accomplish some of its goals. One of its goals was to restrict Iran's nuclear program. It temporarily did do that, of course. But at what cost is the issue. We're in a situation today where Iran is less than a week away from nuclear breakout. We would be close to that position either today or in a few years from now, even if the JCPOA ran its course. The difference would be Iran would be far richer and it would have gained a ton of legitimacy by being welcomed into the broader world for the last 10 years. So while if you look at the numbers from 2015 on 2016 Iran's nuclear program, they were low because of the JCPOA. If you did the path, we wouldn't be in too far of a, we wouldn't be too far away from the point we are at today, even if the JCPOA ran its course. So the idea that we're where we are today because we left the JCPOA, I don't think adds up. I disagree a little bit with the premise of the question. I think during maximum pressure, from 2018 to 2020, there was almost no advancement in Iran's nuclear program. So President Trump pulled out of the JCPOA. Iran's stockpile of 20% enriched uranium did not go up. Iran's stockpile of 60% enriched uranium did not go up. Their centrifuges went up from like 0 to 41 to maybe 100 by 2020. But all of these numbers shot up after President Biden took office. So what that tells me, it's correlation, not causation, but it does seem like there is a different outcome when Iran feels like there's actually going to be a response if they increase and advance their nuclear program. I'll be curious to see what happens in the next few months. I think there was a report yesterday that there's concerns that Iran is actually weaponizing their nuclear program. It's another messaging issue. For some reason, the U.S. intelligence has, for like a decade, assessed that Iran is not building a nuclear weapons program. It doesn't explain why they would have 20% and 60% enriched uranium. It doesn't explain why they would be hiding what they're doing from the IAEA. It doesn't explain why they're building a new facility that's reportedly 100 feet underground near Natanz that can't be hit by U.S. bombs. So there is a slight difference in the approaches and how they've had an effect on Iran's progress moving forward.
Also, the goal of both was to get negotiated in Iran. Could we say it's a different tactic with the same goal?
Yeah, this is an issue that has been going around lately. That it's sensitive, and I think if you look at the first edition of Maximum Pressure, maybe it's fair to say it's two different approaches to the same goal. One appeasement to get a deal, one pressure to get a deal. That's what President Trump himself had said. I think I don't think it's inherent in Maximum Pressure that the goal is a deal. I don't know that. Part of this also depends on what the Islamic Republic wants. Even if the next administration desperately wants a deal and is willing to do what they think is necessary to get a deal, if the Islamic Republic of Khamenei doesn't want one, it won't happen. And this, if we can talk about the elections very quickly in Iran, this is a key point. I think a lot of people say either elections don't matter, or what do you mean elections don't matter? Of course, different presidents had different policies. I would lean towards elections don't matter. They have a point on the other side, but it's not that the policies change because of the president. It's the president and policies change because of what Khamenei wants. So if he wants a deal, he will instruct the president and the government to go negotiate for the best deal that's possible. Whether that's, for example, people will say if the reformist candidate is elected, there's more likely to get a deal. I think if Khamenei wanted a deal under Raisi, he would have told Raisi, go get a deal, and they would have negotiated slightly differently. I don't think it's because of whether there's a hardline or reformist in charge. But that's another part of this equation. Whether the next administration in the U.S. wants a deal or not, it's going to depend on what the Islamic Republic thinks is best. And they still refuse to even negotiate directly with U.S. officials.
We talked about the different tactics of the two administrations. I just have to add, based on position from the White House. They say we've been tough on Islamic Republic of Iran and we put 571 sanctions. That's the number they come up with. So, and they say we didn't lift any sanction. So
that's all good and fine, and I hope that's true. And I do think a lot of that is true. But you have to look at the results. We put out a graph just showing some of the data, but their oil exports are way up, their military expenditure is way up, their GDP is way up, their nuclear program is way up. So whatever we're doing isn't working. Even if you don't lift the sanctions, we're clearly not enforcing them. You can say that it's because they've developed sophisticated sanctions evasion techniques, which I'm sure that they have, especially with China. But we need to develop ways to monitor that and to enforce these sanctions. That should be a primary goal. And so just adding new sanctions doesn't fix that problem. We're very happy to see some of the new things that were put in place. The Massa Act, for example, instilled some new sanctions capabilities. We haven't seen them used yet. We're pushing for that. But yeah, you can say what you want. It's about the results and the outcomes, and those have not been good.
We touched about the last hostage deal that Iran made, $6 billion. The hostage taking was one of the first acts of Islamic Republic. That was the first thing that they've done. They're still doing it. Apparently, it's a very profitable industry for them. Why over 40 years with all these tools, Bob Levinson Act, lots of sanctions or so, nothing had stopped this money-making machine for Islamic Republic of Iran?
It's remarkable, and they're very public about this. They say the solution to our economic problems is to take hostages. And to be clear, the solution to the economic problems is to take hostages from the U.S. The way to get their worst war criminals back who have been arrested around the world is to take hostages from the rest of the world. So we just saw Hamid Nouri freed in this hostage deal. I think a prisoner swap is better than giving them $6 billion, but not for someone this evil with this much blood on his hands. Now, there's no perfect answer. We have to get our people home. One of the problems is that people keep going. I've recommended that the U.S. ban the use of U.S. passports for travel to or through Iran. That wouldn't prevent Iranian Americans from going. It would prevent Americans from going, which is not the main supply of hostages, but it is part of it. The only thing that would prevent Iranian Americans from being able to go is closing the interest section in D.C. That's not something NUFDI has suggested. I will say, and this is a very sensitive topic, for a long time, and I think some people would still argue it's a personal choice. It's a personal risk. If I'm going to Iran, I understand I might be taken hostage. That's my choice. I would argue it goes beyond that when your home government, the U.S. government, is likely to pay billions of dollars to get you out. I think the consequences mean that that's no longer just a risk for you. You're risking billions of dollars going to a regime that can be used to now hurt people around the world. But for now, I think the goal should be for the U.S. not to allow Americans to go to Iran. Another big part of this is the transnational repression. You look at cases like Jamshid Sharmad, who was kidnapped in Dubai, and there's been very little repercussion for that. You look at you broke a story last week, but you look at a lot of the stories of Iran hiring biker gangs and gangs around the world to carry out assassinations. The Iran International reporter was stabbed a couple months ago. All of this is not an accident. This is part of their goal of cracking down on dissidents around the world. And it's entirely unacceptable, and there's way more that needs to be done on that.
At the beginning, we touched about the killing of Mahsa Amini in Iran and the aftermath. In last 20 years or something, we've seen every 2-3 years some kind of a civil unrest, people uprising in some ways or another. Usually all of them are with tragic news, from Nada al-Sultan to killing of Mahsa Amini. But the Islamic Republic survived almost all of those. Do you think this is the one that they can survive as well, the women life freedom?
I think a lot of people, including myself, thought maybe this 2022 was a revolution, was really going to bring down the regime. It appears now like it was just one more big step, but one more step towards that moment. And there will probably need to be another crisis, maybe succession crisis in Iran to trigger that movement. With that said, I think it did accomplish a lot in terms of both weakening the regime, but also changing the narrative in a very important way. For a long time, and we spoke about this briefly, for a long time in DC, in the West, there was two misconceptions about Iran. One, that reforming the regime is possible. Two, that it was taboo to say regime change. We shouldn't say regime change. Both of those things have changed, and that's because of the Iranian people, that's because of the Women, Life, Freedom movement. Even, I think Reuters, it was a couple months ago, which isn't, it definitely doesn't have an anti-regime bias, let's say, wrote that the concept of reformists inside of Iran is dead, and has been for some time. There's a ton of articles now about, yes, there was a genuine reformist movement inside Iran at one point. Khamenei cracked down on that. The Islamic Republic doesn't allow genuine reformists to run. So this is one of the things that changed with the movement. The other big one is this concept of regime change. Even organizations that did have maybe a pro-regime bias at some point were forced to acknowledge the Iranian people want regime change, therefore that's what we have to say at this point. U.S. government officials even could comment and say regime collapse maybe. But that's a big moment. For so long, the idea that regime change, that we could support regime change, was seen as like a 1953 coup, CIA, whatever, and it would delegitimize the movement, and that's not true anymore. Obviously, with NUFDI, we wrote a memo with FDD on maximum support. All of that is maximum support, maximum pressure is geared towards supporting the Iranian people in their fight for regime change. And I think that's a really big step in DC.
The other thing about Women, Life, Freedom is that it's not you can't call it dead, because you could see women, girls, still civil disobedient every chance I get, but at the same time you don't see big chant on the street. Do you think it is even possible to stop this movement?
For the regime to stop the movement?
Yeah.
I don't think it doesn't seem like they can go back to a point before the movement started. They are adept at cracking down on protests. They've done it for 40 years. They do it violently, then they take you off the street and kill you behind closed doors after this sham trial. So they know what they're doing. But it's hard to believe that there's a world where everyone inside Iran wears a hijab all day and there's no protest on it and there's no videos of morality police attacking women. That seems to be the norm these days. So I don't think it stops, and that's why the U.S. needs to prepare for this next triggering moment, because the Iranian people clearly are not done with this. We see videos literally every day of something happening where someone is some form of civil disobedience, whether it's intentional or not. It comes off as civil disobedience and they're punished for it. And so that's really the concept of our maximum support is there's a new moment coming. The U.S. needs to be ready, and here's a lot of the things that we can do.
We can talk for hours, I'm sure, but let me ask the last question, if I may. What we've seen in the last 2 years with the massive movement, Women, Life, Freedom, there were lots of movements from the dissidents, opposition outside Iran to do something, come up with something, make something out of support for the Iranian people. I don't want to make it a controversial issue, so I'm not going to name any name, but clearly hasn't been worked. Mm-hmm. Could you give us why that's not working, and if it needs to work, what needs to be changed or done?
Yeah, so my focus always on U.S. policy, and I think that's relevant to the question. The Iranian community, diaspora inside Iran, clearly hasn't yet unified around one person. I don't think that's necessary. The unification that we saw around policy in the last few years is remarkable. If the Massa Act is one example in America, where hundreds of Iranian Americans who had never been involved in policy, in government, in advocacy, became pros, and eventually got a law passed into U.S. law, a bill passed into U.S. law. I think that is one of the many things that happened in the last few years that showed we have our disagreements on personalities, maybe. Everyone has disagreements. No one is a monolith. The Iranian diaspora, of course, is not a monolith, like most diasporas. But we do agree on policy. There's a lot that we agree on in terms of what needs to be done to help the Iranian people to get to a certain point where regime change is possible, regime change by the people inside of Iran. And that was really encouraging to me. So there's a lot of focus from people about the disunity and the dysfunction and infighting. I personally like to focus on the positive side of things, which to me I think is the unification around policy. That's been really encouraging, and I think there's a lot of potential when we come together like this to get real things accomplished inside the U.S. government, regardless of who the president or who Congress is.
Thank you so much for your time, Andrew. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate you having me on.
از شما بینندگان و شنوندگان عزیزم سپاسگزارم، تشکر میکنم. با برنامه این هفته یک نگاه همراه بودین. تا هفته دیگه و برنامه دیگه، بدرود و خدا نگهدار.